You're listening to the School of Connection podcast, episode 2.
Welcome to the School of Connection podcast with Rana Olk. Each week, she'll connect you with the stories and wisdom of people doing extraordinary work that's changing the world. If you're hungry for growth and love inspiration, you're in the right place. Each episode will give you practical insights and ideas that you can take action on starting today. And now, your host, founder and chief connectologist, Rana Olk.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. So, my goodness, today we have a really big topic to cover. One that I think we could speak for hours about, but we're going to try to bring you insights within less than an hour. And to prepare you, I want to ask you one thing. What are your biases or prejudices? That is a tough one. We all have them. And get this, even though we don't like admitting to having them sometimes, it's really good that we do. And yes, I did say that. There is a benefit to us having biases, and unfortunately, when it goes into prejudice and racism, then it becomes the cause of so much disconnection and polarization in our culture. There is a science behind all of this, and that's what I wanted to bring you all today. My guest, Shonte Jovan-Taylor, is one of my favorite people out there right now. She is the founder of the OptiMind Neuroscience Institute. She's a neuroscientist and success trainer. She is going to enlighten us on what this business of unconscious bias is about, that you may have been hearing here and there a little bit, but she's going to tell us also how to begin tackling these issues in a much more effective way. So without further delay, Shonte, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the School of Connection.
Thank you so much for having me, Rana. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you. So let's, like I said, we have a lot to cover here today. So let's start with unconscious bias. What does that mean? Could you define it for us?
Yes. So unconscious bias is something that happens under our awareness. Our thoughts, our behaviors, somehow we're triggered under our awareness. And those triggers have something to do with how we've been programmed, how we've been taught. And so we act on those unconscious ways of thinking that some people would call bias, or being partial, being favorable or unfavorable to a group of people, or a way of thinking about systems, if you will.
Great. So to somebody, now you're saying these are unconscious. So if somebody says, well, wait, I know that it's wrong to be biased or prejudiced against a particular group of people or, ethnicity, but so there's no way I'm biased. I'm not prejudiced. I'm not biased. What would you say to them?
I would say bias has been given a negative connotation, because whenever we're talking about bias, we're always talking about those very uncomfortable subject matters like racism, like sexism and ageism, right? And nobody wants to be put in the box. Nobody wants to be told that they're racist or sexist, right? Mm-hmm. That just doesn't make you feel good, and you automatically become defensive. And rightly so, because most people are inherently good people. Most people want to feel like they are treating people with kindness, right? So I think that once we understand bias from the lens of the brain and the mind, we can better kind of knock down those barriers and defensiveness and even that discomfort that comes with talking about situations that are affecting people in the workplace, at home, in the educational system, that we still must discuss, but we need to make sure that when we discuss it, that people come with their open mind. And so we have to understand what this bias really is. And like you said earlier, we all have bias, but we need to be able to tease out when bias is being, when it's actually, causing adverse effects on people versus is it just a natural part of the human psyche? And I'm here to say, as a neuroscientist, that we are all born to be biased, and it's energetically sound for the brain to have preferences.
Okay, I want people to really hear that because it is so important. That is why I was saying having biases is actually, in a way, good. It's a good thing. It's a sign of something good. So that's what you're about to speak to right now, right? Explain that.
Well, bias is a necessary thing for the brain. It's a resourceful way of using our mental energy. If you know about the brain, you know that the brain uses up 20% of the total body energy. That's a lot of energy, right? So the brain uses up the most energy of any organ in the body, and it only weighs 3 pounds. Okay.
Wow.
But the way we were able to evolve above our animal counterparts was that we learned how to be more efficient in how we use our mental energy, our brain flow, to fuel our more advanced part of the brain, okay, which is the very front part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we had to try to understand something every time we came across it, that wouldn't be energetically a sound. So if we went to the store, for example, and we were in the cereal aisle, to have to go through every cereal as if it's a new experience, as if we didn't have a preference, every single time, that's mentally draining to have to do that every time. So instead, your brain has bias. It has a preference for a certain brand or a certain, type of ingredients. All of that has been established over time. And now the brain doesn't have to use mental energy to think about it. Now it becomes subconscious. Now you naturally go towards the colors and the brand and the writing and all that, right? So that's a lot of reason why we buy unconsciously, right?
So how does this translate? Like, let's say, I think it's easy for us to understand that we have a preference for, a particular car or a cereal or clothing or something. It's about preferences. How did we evolve to have preferences for certain types of people?
Well, it's definitely a survival mechanism, right? Because you think about it, we have to have a preference for the type of human we want to take care of us. Right?
Yeah, okay.
Start making those mental patterns of, okay, this human seems to be, feeding me whenever I cry or holding me. So all of those, human needs, those survival needs, love, affection, food, shelter, and all that, you start associating the people in your life that are more likely to tend to your human needs. And normally that's your mother or your father.
So it's normally people who look like us
right.
that we see around us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, if you're talking about normal circumstances, but there are instances where people are adopted,
Sure.
different, racial groups and all of that. So
I'm talking about like evolving wise, like,
right.
That's how we evolved in these tribes, right? Does that have anything to do with it? Okay. Mm-hmm.
So people call it bias, but you can easily replace bias with more appealing or neutral words like preference or assumptions, right? I'm just going to assume that this person who keeps taking care of me is good and is going to take care of me. So that means you don't have to keep using mental energy to keep figuring out who's going to take care of me. So that's how we make our attachments through mental pathways that allow us to form preferences, partiality, assumptions, or what people know is bias. Okay. And that's why when we talk about this, when we train people or teach people or educate people on what bias is, we start to bring down the mental defenses, right? Mm-hmm. As soon as you tell somebody, oh, you have to do unconscious bias training, in their mind, they're triggered. Oh, you're automatically telling me I have to go to this training because you believe I'm inherently racist.
Oh my gosh, that is such a great point to drive home. But like what happened with the Starbucks.
Absolutely. So it's like you have to, you want people to be open when they come to learn, because people, they do want to be equal in their thinking. Okay. Sure. But, having unconscious bias may not allow you to do that, on a conscious level. But if you already tell them, if you label them subconsciously as racist or sexist or something like that by saying you have to go to this training that's specifically called unconscious bias, and they're triggered and they're making the assumption that, oh, you must think I am racist or sexist, or I have the potential to be. And then their amygdala, or that threat brain, that primitive brain, is automatically going to get activated. And we don't want people activated. So you describe bias, you educate about bias, saying that we all have them. It's a natural thing. And that's why neuroscience is so powerful, because neuroscience is the neutralizer of what makes us become defensive or what makes us become advanced. So we want to, break down those barriers of conversation so that people can learn how not to be unconsciously biased if it's going to negatively affect people's decision making, that may disenfranchise other people.
So tell us a little bit about what happens when people go into a training like that or hear the word bias at all and get defensive. You said something about the amygdala being activated. Could you tell us a little more what happens?
Oh, absolutely. So if someone is not aware of what bias really means, like I started off, I said, negative bias, unconscious bias has a negative connotation automatically, culturally. We automatically assume it's a bad thing. Therefore, if that's a bad thing and I'm forced to go to a training or somebody is calling me that, then I must therefore be inherently bad. Mm-hmm. And I don't accept that. And so the threat brain goes off, that part of the brain called the amygdala, because you are now threatening my core, mm-hmm. my morality, mm-hmm. right? And I don't like that. So I'm going to automatically go into fight mode. Okay. Or flight mode. No, I don't want to go to this training. No, I'm going to defend myself. I'm not biased, but
and then they're not listening. They're not really hearing.
Yes, because thank you for bringing that up, because once that amygdala is activated, it's very powerful. It has the power to redirect blood flow from the higher part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex that allows you to think logically, pause and breathe through and be open-minded. That part of the brain loses blood flow to the lower primitive parts of the brain that feels like you should survive this moment because somebody is threatening your very being and survival as a person. So it's very important in this new era of awareness that, racism exists, sexism exists, ageism exists, all of it exists, but we have to start updating how we are training people, how we are educating people, because, really the people who want to go to these unconscious bias trainings, they're probably not as biased, negatively biased as other people. The people who need to go to these unconscious bias,
they're the defensive ones.
They're the defensive ones. So you have to be advanced in how you approach people before you even tell them there is a training, right? And the way to do that is to really educate people on this term called bias, right? And then start using more neutral terms as well. We all have basic assumptions. We all have the mental mechanisms that don't want to use a lot of energy to think about everyday things. And sometimes, unfortunately, that leads to assumptions about people's names, about, how people look and all that. And if you put it to them like this, it allows them to be more curious. Like, yeah, where in my life did I make that assumption? Right? Now that I've rectified it in my head, that some biases are good. We're designed to be biased because it's an important part of survival. So you have to appeal to people's emotional mind and logical mind so that they can be more open-minded for what it comes next, which is how do you bring the unconscious bias that may be negatively affecting their decisions or behaviors or treating people unequally to the forefront, to the conscious mind. So there's some steps that have to be taken care of before we can truly, address this thing called unconscious bias that, that causes so much negative consequences in organizations.
Perfect. So what are some of those steps? Or where would you start?
Yes. A lot of steps.
I know. We're going to try to cover this.
Well, one thing people need, I think all people on the planet, and I'm biased, okay, I'm partial. Everybody on the planet who has a brain needs to know about their brain. It's called neuroscience. Learn more about your brain. Understand that you have these, wonderful parts of your brain. Some of them are older than others. Some of them are more instinctive. Some of them are more advanced. And you have to start deciding consciously what part of the brain do you want to operate at different times of your life, in the day, in the year. What type of leader do you want to be, parent, and all of that? And your brain tells the story of which part of the brain dominates. It's the most advanced part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, should be dominating and regulating those parts of the brain that think you're always in threat mode all the time, right?
So I think most people have heard, there's left brain, right brain, but what you're talking about is totally different. Like you said, the prefrontal cortex, we talked about the amygdala. So we're really talking about whether or not you're operating from the prefrontal cortex or the amygdala. Would that be a correct characterization?
Well, I would say that the more we learn about our brain and mind, the more we can start consciously learning how to navigate our lives from the top brain down or the bottom brain up. So the bottom parts of your brain are your more primitive parts, your instinctive, your unconscious parts of your brain, where you don't really think about, breathing or your heart beating or, selecting that cereal off the shelf, right? Mm-hmm. And those are fine decisions. I mean, we don't need to use mental energy to think about our hearts beating thousands of times a day. Okay, that's mentally draining. So we need unconscious programs. We need those subconscious activities going on so we don't have to be overwhelmed mentally. But the higher functions, the top of your brain, the most advanced part of your brain, it takes more effort to learn how to cultivate it and strengthen it and know when to use it consciously, so that when you are in normal situations and someone triggers you, are you operating from the fight or flight response, or are you navigating that prefrontal cortex to allow you to regulate that amygdala in that lower part of the brain so it doesn't seize all your blood flow from the more logical, part of your brain that allows you to have an open mind and plan for the future and use higher judgment and awareness. So I would say the number one thing on the planet is for people to learn how to use their brain just a smidgen better. I mean, if people
even a smidgen would make a big difference, is what you're saying.
I live in Texas, and we have these ants. We have red ants, right? Tiny little things, but if they bite you, I mean, they have like a micromolar of venom that will wreak havoc on your leg, for days to come. So just imagine knowing neuroscience just a smidget more about how your brain works. Just understanding that it uses up 20% of the total body energy will allow you to reprioritize where you're putting your time and energy. Because you don't want to be mentally worn out doing things that are not important or may not move the needle forward in your life or profession, because you don't want to wear out your brain. So you become more aware of how you are using your time and energy, because now you're thinking of your priorities, your productivity with the brain in mind. So that's always my number one go-to. Start educating yourself about how you use your mind and your brain. And we need to know what would the world look like if there wasn't negative unconscious bias. And I'm using negative unconscious bias because, like we've been talking about earlier, there's nothing wrong with unconscious bias in general. It only becomes a problem if we start making unconscious decisions that negatively affect others or the environment, simply because we weren't exposed to a certain group of people, or we let society or TV push these paradigms or these stereotypes.
True.
Never went unchecked, right? And no, since they're not unchecked, they become a part of our way of thinking, our belief systems about groups of people, ideas and all that. So you're not really taught to modify that way of thinking. But if we think about the consequences and the benefits of negative unconscious bias, then we're more motivated to check ourselves, or even before we even check ourselves, to question, is this a moment where I could potentially be biased? Just having that internal question will get your mental gears turning. Like, let me look at this again. What did I do with this application when I seen that it was a name foreign to me?
Interesting. Okay, so that's one example of where it might come into play. It's about being aware, and you said an application, like a job application. Is this name triggering a stereotype in my head?
Right.
Okay.
Not even any kind of application, job application can determine whether or not the person gets the interview or not, right? Or if they even read the whole resume, right? So a way to externally overcome that bias is to start taking names off resumes. Have someone go through the resumes and black out names maybe, or, just temporarily, so that you can remove that potential unconscious bias, from your mind, and then go back and look at the names and see where you're triggered, if something comes up for you, right? And that's one way to modify or, deal with unconscious bias without feeling defensive. Right. And people also, we have applications for a lot of things, right? Renting apartments, for example, right? That's another way, unconscious bias can come. Well, can this person really pay? This sounds like an African-American name, because kind of, lump names and, where people went to school, even for, on applications. All that can come into play. What if you went to the opposing school and you were like one of those diehard, opposers, CLA, and they were always at odds with USC, right? So, those can come into play. And those are things that took place in the past, right? That shaped your narrative about how people are at another school, right? So if we ask ourselves, where am I potentially being biased? it may activate something for you. It may make you feel uncomfortable, and that's okay, because you have to move through that discomfort. You said something earlier before we got on. You said to move through it, you have to do it. What did you say?
To get to it, you have to move. through it to it, or so, I don't even remember. We were talking about me getting to something, and you said, and I said, to get to something, I have to get through it. To get to the part where this is easy. That's what I was talking about, where podcasting is easy. To get to the part where it's easy and feels more comfortable, I have to go through it. You
have to go through it. Exactly. So even with addressing our own unconscious bias, we have to go through the discomfort. And
so and I don't mean to cut you off, but this kind of makes me think, if somebody were to say to me right now, make a list, which I've learned to do this, so I'm kind of cheating here. I'm putting myself in the place of the audience. Okay. I made a list of some of the biases and stereotypes and assumptions that I have. Preferences, let's call them. I could, and I did, make a list of several things. And like you said, it's not comfortable, but it is about having to be honest with ourselves and take inventory before we can know what needs changing, right? Like I have a preference and a bias for people with a particular education or particular cultures or particular hobbies. So I know that each and every one of us has dozens of these. Am I correct?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so we can make a list of them, and some of them are going to be ugly. Yes.
And it's easier to do that when you're by yourself, right? But if someone is asking you, what are your biases? You're going to get defensive. It's going to be uncomfortable. And those unconscious biases will remain suppressed. It's very challenging to bring your subconscious thoughts to your conscious thoughts if you're not adept at it, if you haven't practiced it, if you're not intentional about it, if you don't put your brain in an environment to allow those things to bubble up and surface. Because there's sometimes people have good intentions to write something down, right? They have their pen and their paper, but then they get brain freeze, right?
Yeah.
They're stuck. So there are opportunities just throughout the day, and it depends on your profession, right? If you're in HR and you're, responsible for hiring, you can easily go to a resume and say, where in this process do I have the potential to be biased? Then you are activating your prefrontal cortex to be more aware that there is a possibility that in this process you might be biased. So it'll easily come to your prefrontal cortex or consciousness. Now, if you understand the benefits and the consequences, though, of negative unconscious bias, we'll be more motivated to make those efforts, okay?
Yeah.
So if people understood that this is something that happens to your brain, if people perceive that they are being stereotyped, or there's racism or ageism or sexism or whatever ism, okay, their brains will naturally react subconsciously. So you may be thinking it's one-sided, right? But it's actually affecting the receiver. So the receiver may feel like if they subconsciously picked up on that, because we're all subconscious beings.
Oh, yeah, we do pick it up, don't we?
We pick it up in tone and action and in opportunities, right? If we're seeing some kind of unfairness, equality, we're going to be triggered in our own brains. Sure. Our amygdala will get activated. Blood flow from our cognitive, prefrontal cortex will, be reversed. And so if our cognitive abilities are reduced, then we're not able to focus. We're not able to perform. We're not able to create, in our environment. So it's not beneficial for people to not understand their role, their potential role in contributing to unconscious biases that lead to the disenfranchisement of their workforce, for example, or in education. I mean, teachers can do this too with their students. You assume that one student is so bright, they never need attention. So that's a bias, right? That's a negative bias, just to assume that this student will rarely need my attention because they just get it, And if that student has that idea, if they feel that from you, when they do have a problem, and I was one of these students, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember in grade school, my teacher just assumed that I got everything. And so I wouldn't ask for help.
Yeah.
And then it would come out, my deficit would come out in other ways, and it would be kind of devastating, right?
Yeah, I totally get that.
Bias can happen in multiple different ways. So we want people to be able to function cognitively. We want them to be creative and have a high IQ. So we want to minimize the negative conscious bias in processes, systems, and in our everyday living.
How does it hurt all of us? Because, and I do want to mention this before we end today, and that is, for somebody out there who isn't the recipient or on the receiving end of any kind of negative bias, why should they care?
Okay, that's a great question, because if you have potentially subconscious, negative subconscious biases, it's still affecting your brain.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because when something doesn't become aligned with your way of seeing things because of your bias, you're going to get triggered. Your, amygdala, fight or flight, response will go up. Your blood pressure can go. Your cognitive abilities reduce because you're in conflict, because you have this belief system about this person and it's not being aligned because this person is not receiving, or maybe you're getting blowback. Or maybe somebody's saying you need to go to unconscious bias training, but your belief system is, no, I'm not biased. So it's affecting you on a neurophysiological level.
Whether I realize it or not.
You
just
realize
I'm biased.
Exactly. And if we talk about just organizations, if we are biased in our approach for diversity, to be inclusive, you're cutting off the potential of your bottom line in the organization, of the creativity in your organization, and the overall success, because diversity advances the overall IQ of an organization, of a team, and if people on the receiving end perceives that there is not a great deal of diversity, or they're not being included, or they're being excluded or not promoted and everything, that's setting up the organization for lawsuits. Okay, so the organization loses money because you haven't taken care of your bias problem, right? And so if people see that it can hit them in the pocket, and it affects them physically, and that it's affecting their overall creativity, innovation, and all of that, they can kind of put it into perspective, like, let me go ahead and figure out what my biases are so that I can minimize these other consequences of negative unconscious bias.
Wow. And everything you just mentioned, I mean, the ripple effects, right, of having these negative biases, thinking about connection. I mean, we care about connection here. There's disconnection, there's polarization, seemingly now more so than ever in our society. And meanwhile, concurrently, there is an epidemic. What we're being told is an epidemic of loneliness. People are feeling lonely and disconnected and want to be able to feel more belonging. And yet here we are with all these biases. And now that we know better and we can peer into the brain, which we weren't able to do 20 years ago, the way we do now, right?
Right.
There's so many studies on this. Like, it really behooves all of us to begin to look more into the brain and begin to understand more of these topics, and so we can do better. So we can do better overall. I want to ask you, Shonte, I really want to know why do you do this? Because you're a neuroscientist, and we talked about unconscious bias today, but you are also very much involved in discussions of the neuroscience of leadership, entrepreneurship, but also compassion and empathy and gratitude. What drives you? What's your mission?
Yes, my mission. Well, first of all, I want to say that neuroscience, I believe, is the final frontier of understanding human potential. Mm-hmm. And I also believe that it is the next necessary step for us to advance ourselves you know, in evolution, right? To be the highest form of ourselves on this planet and beyond. You know, it's a beautiful, physical, organic, ever-growing, malleable entity that is always searching for the next level of itself. You know, we're the only species to do this.
Yeah.
So in my earlier career, I focused on brain deficits, right? Dementia, brain injuries, which is still an important work to do, but I felt intuitively that it wasn't my important work to do. I wanted to help people to optimize their brain before they get to that point, right? Because I started seeing the patterns. Well, if people did certain things in their earlier life or had more awareness of activities or, you know, that would enhance or detract from their mental abilities, then maybe they wouldn't be in this situation. So I felt like I wanted to be on the more preventative, but not just preventative, the optimization of how we use our brains and minds as human beings, right? So that's where and that was also something that I was striving for. I am striving for and continue to strive for, is to optimize my own brain and mind, because I'm just fascinated with the potential of what our brain power can do. And of course, you said it. I mean, it's only been about 20 years since we've been able to peer inside the brain and say, hey, this is what mindfulness and meditation, and this is what happens to your brain if you think like this versus like this, or you do this activity versus this activity. And so
we virtually can literally see what thoughts do to our brain.
Exactly.
Right?
Thoughts, I mean, it's exploded our potential. It has exploded our potential.
There we go.
For what we can do every day now, versus trying to clean it up later. Okay. And so there's so many things that haven't been done yet or discovered yet. And I believe that the brain is the key to dealing with societal issues like unconscious bias, negative unconscious bias. So we hold the secrets in this universe in our head to deal with 1,000-year-old issues that humans have had. It's time to neutralize them. It's time to solve them. But we can't solve the issues with the same mind that created them. So that means we have to update how we use our minds so that we can not only solve these, you know, old world problems, but, you know, look forward to the future and do things that we've never done before.
Awesome. Shonte, for our listeners, I hope this was really helpful. Neuroscience is something I'm very passionate about. So I really, really thank you for coming on. I have one last important question for you. It's the most important question before we leave. But before that, just briefly, can you tell any of our listeners who want to know more and learn more about their brains where to find you?
Oh, absolutely. So you can just type in my name.com, ShonteTaylor.com. I'm sure Rana will have it somewhere listed at ShonteTaylor.com. And there you can pick up my free ebook on the top 10 neuroscience principles that every leader, coach, and modern thinker should know. And you can also get more awareness about our conferences, our Optimind conferences and programs that we have, so that you can truly go to the next level of your thinking, your leadership, your coaching, your parenting, your teaching. It's really everything. You're everything. Neuroscience is a 360-degree knowledge. It applies to our lives professionally and personally and in business.
Thank you so much. And I have this one last question, especially for the listeners. Listen up, you guys. One thing that all of us can do and take action on today, starting, that would move us along towards overcoming unconscious bias or bettering our brains.
I have like 10 of them.
I know you do. You have to choose. You have to choose something that, one thing.
Okay, I'm going to say pause. Practice the power of pause today, because negative bias is all about wanting to be right or figuring out if you have it. We don't want to be wrong. Mm-hmm. We want to be right. So when we're challenged about our belief systems, we want, our belief systems to correlate with, the external world, right? And when there's a disagreement in our belief systems and how people respond to something we may have done or said, and we get defensive because it doesn't feel good to be wrong. As a matter of fact, when we are right, when our belief systems do correlate with something from the outside world or a person responds to us favorably, we get a boost of dopamine in the brain, right? We get a reward system. But the opposite occurs when it's wrong. It just doesn't feel good to be wrong. So when it comes to unconscious bias or possible negative unconscious bias, where you might in some way be treating someone differently, or they're trying to give you feedback, whether it's nonverbal or verbal, that, hey, that didn't feel good, that wasn't cool, or why didn't I get the promotion, or I feel like you're treating, Johnny better than me, if you're a parent or something, practice the power of the pause and ask that question. Is this an area in my life that I could possibly be being biased? And let the answer surface. It may not surface right away, but it will come eventually if you are truly in it to change, that internal belief system that just may be contributing, to affecting somebody's world, their lives, in a negative way.
Awesome. Thank you so very much, Shonte. I really appreciate you being here. And thank you to all of you who are listening. Be sure to tune in again. Shonte, we may have to have you on again someday because there's too much to talk about with you and too much to learn from you. And I think our listeners would really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank your audience for listening and being tuned in to another way of thinking about life and about themselves. I think, you all are the true learners, and we need you all to just start thinking on another level to really guide society to their highest selves. And Rana, I appreciate you connecting me to your world and your tribe and, helping to end this process.
I think that's a great place to end. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the School of Connection podcast. Be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes, and visit schoolofconnection.com/podcast for the show notes.